General Manager Evans, Federal Government.
Government, or Mr. Government,
Mr. Chairman, Manager, Mr. General Manager, Chairman, General Manager,
Mr. Chairman, Federal Chairman, Government, Federal
Government,
Mr. Chairman, Federal General Manager, General Manager, General Manager, Mr. Chairman.
Government,
Mr. Chairman, General Manager, Federal Government, Mr. Chairman.
Evans, Chairman, Mr. Evans, Mr. General Manager, Chairman, Federal, Mr. Evans.
Kevin, Chairman, Federal Government, the Federal Government, Federal Government.
The General Manager,
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman,
the federal government.
Mr. Evans, Mr. General Manager, Mr. Evans, the Federal Government, Mr. Evans, Government, General Manager, the Federal, Mr. General Manager.
Mr. Chairman,
The Federal Government, Mr. Chairman, the Federal Government, Mr. Evans, Federal Government, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Evans,
The Federal Government,
the Federal Government, Mr. Evans,
Federal Chairman, General Manager, Mr. Chairman,
the Federal Government, Mr. Evans, Federal Government, Mr. Evans, the Federal Government, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Evans,
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, General Manager, Mr.
Government,
Mr. Evans,
Chairman,
Mr. Evans, the governor. Mr. Evans,
or Federal General,
the manager.
Government, or Federal,
The federal.
General,
Mr. Chairman Evans, a
Federal Government,
Mr. General Manager, General Manager,
Mr. Evans, the Federal Government, General Manager, Mr. Evans,
Chairman, General Manager,
the Chairman, Mr. General Manager, Mr. Evans, General Manager, Mr. Evans, the General Manager,
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Evans,
Mr. Evans, Mr. General Manager.